Okay, welcome everyone for our first epic talk of the winter quarter. And we're incredibly excited to have Bill Brown, who's the CEO of Net Power, here with us. Before doing that, he was a co-founder of Eight Rivers Capital. And before that, he was a professor at Duke Law and had a long career on Wall Street with Goldman and AIG and Morgan Stanley. So I hesitate to really try to even provide context for what Bill's doing. I think he'll be the best person to explain it, but I'll just try to stumble my way through a little context. So when one looks around the world, it's evident that there are fossil fuels everywhere. Everywhere you turn, there's more fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel companies are really brilliant at finding new fossil fuels, and that's been a tremendous boon to society. Fossil fuels have provided energy for billions of people at extraordinarily low cost. The challenge with them, as we talk a lot about EPIC, is both the air pollution, although I think that's not really the focus today, and also the CO2 emissions associated with them. And when you begin to think about how one might address climate change and the alternative, the playing field does not look super compelling in the sense that renewables, well, there's been great improvements. They'll never be getting around their intermittency. The battery technologies continue to make progress, but there's still a long ways to go. Nuclear is another alternative. I think it might be fair to say that at least in the United States, we don't even know what the cost of nuclear is, and we may not know for a long time. It seems far, far out of the money, and no one seems willing to build one. Hydro is not available everywhere. And then there's like lurking in the background is, there's going to be carbon capture and sequestration one day. But people have not made a lot of progress on that. And thus far, I think there are only 2 operating plants they both use the captured carbon for enhanced oil recovery. So what Bill is going to talk about is his company and their technology, and which broadly fits in, I think, importantly fits into the playing field, and it provides a continued use for the bountiful natural gas that is in North America, and I suspect will be around the world, and tries to do it in a way that it recognizes the carbon problem, and we're all dying to hear some details. Thank you for coming, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. I consider myself extremely fortunate to be at the University of Chicago, which is where so much analysis about practical things in the world started. I mean, you guys have a rich heritage here about economics, about science, about just expanding your world. One of the things that's interesting about technology development is that we end up generally dealing on the edge of existing technologies. We end up thinking, how do we make what we have today better? How do we make incremental improvements? And what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that was maybe incremental but thought to be impossible. And so therefore they let it go. So with that, let's start looking at this company called Net Power. Science Magazine did an article recently entitled Fossil Power Guilt-Free. That's a pretty bold assertion, because generally we think of fossil with guilt, and those two things go together in many people's minds. We all, though, operate with prejudices. Water, fire, CO2, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Although fire and water can be bad, and in California, as of right now, we've seen fire followed by water being bad. Generally think of fire and water as being good. I think we need to think the same way about CO2. Up here you can see the carbon cycle. The two pairs of arrows on the right show the way that the Earth and the ocean interchange carbon dioxide with the atmosphere. There's a lot of CO2 out there. The problem that we have is that arrow set on the left. CO2 is okay, it's just in the wrong place. It's like fire and water. How do we get CO2 in the right place? Well, first, let's start with some of the things that we all take for granted, but let's make sure that we're on a similar page. Some of us know more about these than others. How do you build an energy system? You've got a lot of building blocks. You've got traditional fuels, you've got fossil fuels, you've got coal, gas, you've got nuclear. You've also got renewables. You've got solar. Solar comes in two varieties: concentrated solar power, where we're getting the heat from the sun, and then photovoltaics, where we're converting the photons to electrons. We've got mass movement in three different forms: wind movements, ocean, hydro. We're moving mass that nature, we're taking the mass that nature moves and converting that to energy. Then we've got the storage. The storage that we've been using for a long time is pumped hydro. We take water from a low level, and when it's off peak, we pump it to a high level and let it fall back down through a turbine in times of peak load. We all know batteries. We've known them since we were a child. Flashlight was one of the first things we ever played with. And in fact, one of the problems, I think, with storage is that we all take that childhood understanding of batteries and we assume that it can be extrapolated. And in some respects it can, and in some respects it cannot. Then there are these other things, hydrogen and the like, which is a topic for a totally different discussion, but for whatever it's worth, I do believe that in the not too distant future, that we're finally at the point where a hydrogen ecosystem will evolve. And one of the things that we're working on with the net power process is how to produce hydrogen in a green fashion at much lower cost than it was thought you could do before, so that we can actually use hydrogen that we produce also in existing natural gas power plants. But that's for a later discussion. So in focusing on putting together the energy system, what are the metrics? I mean, generally we think sustainable, reliable, and affordable. And that comes in with all sorts of parameters. But we put all this together with those types of energy technologies, and we find that with traditional energy technologies, the pluses, there's an installed base. It's compatible with the grid. It's always available. It's inexpensive, assuming you get rid of the externalities. Minuses, the fuels are depletable. There's an environmental impact. The nuclear is not economic in a cheap gas economies. And the current approaches to their externalities of CCS and regulations, they add costs that many people find to be unacceptable. Renewables are a different type of energy. We've got the majority of the costs in renewables are in the construction. The energy source is free. Minimal environmental impact. But the problems of intermittency and the unpredictability. I mean, it's one thing to be intermittent, to know that your solar is going to be running between 10 and 2, but it's another thing for clouds to come over. It's another thing for something like happening in South Australia to occur. So there are the unpredictabilities of renewables. We also know that renewables are incomplete unless they're coupled with affordable storage or traditional energy sources. And then storage. Takes us to pumped hydro. We know pumped hydro, it happens to be the oldest form of storage and actually the cheapest. But even with storage, there are externalities. There are externalities of building. pumped hydro. There are externalities of mining lithium. There are externalities of disposing of lithium. And furthermore, it's still not cheap enough. Renewables have diminishing returns. And this is something I don't think that people fully understand. There are these two guys, Steve Brick and Sam Thernstrom, who did a top-down analysis of the energy systems of three locations: Germany, California, and Wisconsin. Wisconsin, partly because one of them happens to teach at the University of Wisconsin. And probably that's the way he got his research funded. But they looked at the top-down costs of energy in those three jurisdictions. And they said, what does it look like if we have a two-system world? For those of you who have done business courses, this might look similar to an efficient frontier in a finance course, mixing between stocks and bonds. And it's not that dissimilar. So as you see up here, when we get to the lower left, we started out with a 100% natural gas combined cycle. And across those three jurisdictions, the blended cost across those three jurisdictions on a production-weighted basis is roughly $60 per megawatt hour. But there's zero capture of carbon. Natural gas combined cycle is just spewing all the carbon in the atmosphere. What if you want to get rid of 50% of the carbon? Well, fine. Let's go to a 50% renewable portfolio standard, RPS, and then mix in combined cycle as needed. Well, it so happens, by the way, that as you see, you still have to have 80% of the original combined cycle power plants that you had to start with, even with a 50% renewable portfolio. Yet, you cut the cost of, you cut the amount of CO2 emissions in half, and you double the price of electricity, no big deal. Those are sort of trade-offs that we think we can deal with. But as you see, as you go farther and farther into decarbonization, and let's go all the way out to the 85% part, you end up with energy costs having gone increased more than 5 extra times. Furthermore, you end up with a 200% renewable portfolio. Why? Because half of the renewables are providing your base load, the other half is going into storage, and you have storage systems. And you still need 77% of those original gas plants to meet the intermittency and unpredictability. So costs go up. You put all this together, and this study came out of MIT recently, and we look at the projected mix of renewables, hydro, nuclear, gas, bio, oil, and coal. And you see a number of things happening, but the most important thing you see is that gas, oil, and coal are around for a long time. Now, that's their view. The bottom line, though, is this. We probably will end up emitting too much carbon dioxide unless we can drive down the costs. Or the other way around it is that we're willing to pay the extra costs. But we do know that CO2 mitigation is probably going to be expensive. But if we could somehow drive down the costs, and that's where we come in, Net Power. Cost-effective, zero-emission option. Washington Post just came out with an op-ed piece, although I would not put it exactly the way that they put it. I would say that we belong to be looked at alongside renewable energy. Science Magazine came out with a piece. Forbes has come out with a piece. Our basic value proposition is this: selling only electricity with the same pure economics as traditional power plants, but capturing all the carbon dioxide and other atmospheric emissions. If you can do that, you will allow the world to meet every climate target without having to pay more for electricity. We'll come back to this and how we do it later, but let's tick off the advantages of what we do with Net Power. We make electricity from natural gas. We're cost competitive with existing natural gas power plants. We capture or eliminate substantially all the atmospheric emissions and carbon dioxide without any additional cost. Water is not required. In fact, we actually produce water. We can use inexpensive fuels, such as natural gas that's mixed with carbon dioxide, which is otherwise known as acid gas, or sour gas, natural gas that's mixed with hydrogen sulfide. We can use associated gas that comes out of oil production, produce gas. And at the same time, by our very nature, we also produce nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. Now let's go back to our little efficient frontier. And let's look at how Net Power can partner with renewables to change this world. Instead of having natural gas combined cycle power plants, we actually start, along with the renewables, at 100% carbon reduction. And so take that little natural gas combined cycle data point on the bottom of the chart and move it all the way up to the top. Same cost. And now look at how we can blend with the renewables. Because we will be limited, the same way solar and wind will be limited, by our operating environment. In our case, we will be limited by our ability to take the CO2 and do something with it. Places that we can do something with the CO2, great. Our power plants are ideal there. Places where we can't do something with the CO2, you look at solar and wind. Places that have a lot of clouds, that don't have wind or have too much variability in wind, we're more valuable. So it's a mix of all of these, but we changed the mix that people thought was possible. Let's talk about the science. I was told, by the way, not to shy away from science with you guys. So if hold on to your chairs. We're getting ready to go on a sort of a deeper dive. This is what our plant looks like. I don't want you to spend too much time on this diagram, but you can see at the top, we take in natural gas and oxygen, not air, but oxygen, because you can see air goes into this thing on the side called the air separation unit, the ASU. An ASU, for those of you, is a unit that basically through reverse distillation, by cooling air down, reverse distills air so that we can remove the nitrogen, argon, and oxygen. We can separate those three components. You can also keep going farther. You can get the xenon out and things like that out of it in an air separation unit if you want to add more expense to the plant. Air separation units have been around for 100 years, and they really haven't changed for about 100 years. Oh, yes, they've gotten a little more efficient as we made some of the components, but the basic science is the same. So we separate out air into oxygen, and then we've got the nitrogen and argon that we'll talk about later. But we use that oxygen, along with natural gas, to burn in our turbine. Now, why oxygen and natural gas? Well, think of what happens. Think back to your high school chemistry. If I take oxygen and methane, CH4, I get only two things when I burn them. I get CO2 and water. End of story. If I take air, which has a bunch of nitrogen in it, I get CO2 and water, but I also get a bunch of nitrogen. And therein lies the problem with traditional carbon capture. We've looked at this CO2 and oxygen, CO2 and nitrogen that comes out of the back of a power plant, and we say, well, how do we separate these two gas molecules from each other? And we can. It's pure chemistry. The typical way of doing it is through amine post-combustion processing. And we can separate it out. In fact, the 2 plants that are operating today are using that amine post-combustion carbon capture as a way of separating out the nitrogen and the CO2. It requires added equipment, added expense in terms of an efficiency hit, but it does the job. But we also knew that we could do oxygen and methane only, and it's really easy to separate water, a liquid, and CO2, a gas. The problem had always been that that air separation unit was a very expensive piece of equipment, and its energy penalty was massive. And so people had always known about oxycombustion. It's been around forever. I mean, as long as basic chemistry has been understood, we knew that oxycombustion could solve our problem. It was just an expense question. So we always had the solution to the CO2 problem with fossil fuels. It was just too expensive. So we'll get back to why we saw and how we solve those problems. But we take this oxygen and methane in, we combust it, but we also mix it, as you can see at the side, with a bunch of CO2 recycle. I'll tell you why that's important in just a second. And we throw that through a gas turbine, and that gas turbine turns, produces electricity. We cool everything down in a heat exchanger so that we now have CO2 and water. CO2 is a gas, water is a liquid. The water gets separated out. We bleed off a little bit of the extra CO2 that we made and recycle the rest of the CO2. That's the diagram we showed people back in 2011. And they intrinsically understood it as well as you're intrinsically understanding it right now. You say, well, if you say so. Everyone hears, I know you're thinking, if you say so. Let's get more simple. Let's look at what's called a simple cycle gas turbine. This is the simple cycle gas turbine that takes air in that's 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, combusts it with methane, and then uses that to drive a gas turbine. Now, what is a gas turbine? It's just a wind machine. It's taking a bunch of molecules that are going past some blades, and it's taking that rotation, and it's turning that rotation into electricity. If you put a wind turbine behind your house, and on average the wind blew at 10 miles an hour, and that wind turbine were sized to provide enough energy for your house, and then one morning you get up and realize that for some reason the wind is magically blowing at 50 miles an hour instead of 10, you have a lot of excess power to sell. Why? More mass is moving past those turbine blades. So turbines are simply a way of converting mass into rotational energy. The more mass we can have going past blades, the more energy we're going to get out of it. But looking at the top, let's suppose we remove that orange stripe, the nitrogen stripe, and just had so-called oxycombustion. We just had oxygen and methane going past those blades. There's not enough mass anymore. Moving down below, we actually, with our turbine, we've replaced, the best way of thinking about it is we replaced the nitrogen with a lot more CO2 mass. And instead of converting 40% of the energy of methane into electricity, we're able to convert over 80% of it into electricity. But we are having to use up roughly 20% of those electricity units to do two things. One, to separate out the oxygen. That's about 11 percentage points of those energy units go for oxygen separation, and the other 11 or 12 go for recompressing that carbon dioxide to go in the front of that turbine. So We didn't get fully 80, so instead we get this machine. We've got hot CO2 coming in the front of the turbine. That's, most of it's recycled. 94% of the mass coming in the front is carbon dioxide. And by the way, it's gone through the heat exchanger. So now it's hot. It's 712 degrees, 720 degrees centigrade. So it's already hot. We like hot gases. They're much better for power generation than coal gases. And we're just doing plain little oxy-combustion. So one way of thinking about what we've got is we've got a heat pump with CO2 as the operating fluid, as the working fluid in the heat pump, and it's slightly open heat pump. We'll burn a little methane and a little oxygen and produce a little water and a little CO2 into that CO2 heat pump. So we put 6% new mass in, and we get 6% mass out. Water and extra CO2. That is the cycle. Now, this happens. And this, my friends, is, to me, it's fantastically simple, although it's initially complex. What is this? This is a pressure enthalpy diagram. Left and right is something called enthalpy. It's heat. It's not exactly temperature. It's similar to temperature, but it's energy. So if we go from a turbine, we'll talk about how we do this, but if we go from this point here on the turbine, see where I say that little black arrow at the far right? If we go from this many enthalpy units down to here when we come out of the turbine, we gained this much energy. The left-right is the amount of energy we gain. If we're moving to the left, we gain it. If we're moving to the right, we're putting it in. The vertical axis is pressure. It's a log scale here. This is what's called 30 bar, or roughly 30 atmospheres. 1 atmosphere is roughly 15 pounds per square inch. So 450 psi at 30 bar, 30 atmospheres. The top end of this thing is at 300 bar, so 4,500 psi. And all we're doing is we're moving this fluid around this cycle. Some more milestones that you should know on this chart. These blue lines are temperature isobars. And you can see as long as we're on the right-hand part of the chart, our temperature is fairly, temperature and heat are roughly the same. But then they start wrapping around this thing on the left here. What is this thing on the left? Well, above that dome, it's called the biphasic dome. Above that dome, carbon dioxide is what is called supercritical. And you can see that dome comes in just a little above 80 bar. Above that dome is supercritical. Below that dome to the left, CO2 is a liquid. Below that dome to the right, or out to the right of that dome, is gas. And in through here, it's biphasic. Here it's 0% gas, 25% gas, 50% gas, 75%, 100% gas. And for those of you who think back to your thermodynamics, the width of that dome for that given pressure is what is known as the heat of condensation or the heat of evaporation. The boiling point. It's the boiling point for CO2. How much energy it takes CO2 to go from liquid to a gas. So once we start going around this, it's pretty simple. The middle part of this is just simply a heat exchanger. It's like a car radiator. We're going from cold on the left to hot on the right. And then we fire it up at the top of that triangle that sort of looks like the state of Tennessee. We fire it up, and we go that final distance with heat that's added from our fuel. We take it, we expand it through the turbine. Now we talk about the other lines, the purple lines on here. The purple lines are what are called entropy lines. And as you can see, entropy lines in our cycle are like railroad tracks. If you look everywhere on that graph, when we go up an entropy line, and when we go down an entropy line. Well, the entropy lines are flatter on the right, and they're steeper on the left. So that means if you're going to go up, you want to get as far to the left as possible to go up, because it's less energy. And if you want to go down, you want to come down on the right because you'll get more energy out. So that, in essence, is our cycle. The design point of the entire cycle starts here. That is where the hot gases of the turbine go into our heat exchanger. Turbine, we can keep the gases away from the walls of the turbine. We have these film cooling, and the turbine is cooled. There's a lot of ways of keeping the turbine from melting. But the heat exchanger is the very opposite of that. We want heat to be exchanged. We want heat to hit the metal and flow through the metal to the other side. That means that the left-right part of that little point down here is the design point for our heat exchanger material. It's as hot as we can comfortably get and still not melt the heat exchanger. Now, the up-down part of that line is a combination of, it's built by, well, you can think, well, why don't we go all the way down here, take those railroad tracks all the way down here, we'll get a lot more energy out, right? Left to right. The problem is, if we get down here, we got to climb back up here in the recompression. So if you come down too far, you got to climb the ladder all the way back up. That takes too much energy. But look, when we get closer to that dome, we have only a little pitch that we go through what's called compression of CO2. We cool it over the top of that dome, and then we can go pump the CO2. The CO2 is 80% of the density of liquid water. Pumping is easier to do. Pumping liquids is a lot less energy intensive than compressing gases. Go to your filling station and try to fill a tank full of gasoline. At the same time, imagine that you had one of those little air pumps and you're trying to fill a tire just as big as your gas tank. It would take you forever. It takes a long time, a lot of energy to compress air, but pumping that liquid gas, no problem. That's why this chart, once you start getting into it, it touches base with a lot of realities that you observe in your day-to-day life.
Quick question about that.
Yeah.
About that chart. So, my neophyte understanding here is that the axes and kind of the relationships that you're displaying here are kind of, you could apply, they're just standard ways of thinking about a combustion power plant.
That's right.
And what you're showing is that your guys' cycle fits on this in a particularly important place. Like, how should I think about how like and not to pick on anybody, but the CCS plant, the one that Southern's that just bit the dust. Like, how do I think about where people have failed on this chart before?
Well, first of all, because this is the phase diagram or a pH diagram or of CO2. All the other power plants out there do not use CO2 as their working fluid. They use steam as their working fluid.
But the other CCS plants, like
Yeah.
the Southern, what was it Southern? So just they canceled it or whatever?
They canceled the Kemper plant.
Yeah.
They were very different than this.
Okay.
They were doing what's called an IGCC. Everything they were using steam. Let's talk about steam briefly because they would be using steam. Steam is actually not a very good working fluid. Imagine you're on a football field. Let's talk about the property of steam. You know, water boils at 100 degrees C and roughly ambient temperature is at 25 degrees C. And if I'm on the 25-yard line and if I run 75 yards, I go from ambient to boiling. How much energy does it take me to get over that goal line? In other words, what's the difference between here and here when it comes to water? It takes me 7.1 times the amount of energy it took me to run 75 yards. The heat of vaporization of water is immense. So I got to break through that barrier. I got to put. So yeah, they were right. People who said watch pot doesn't boil, it's actually right. It doesn't boil. You heat it up to 99.99, and for that last little fraction of a degree, you have to heat it up 7 times more to get it to boil. And then in a steam plant, you keep running 400 more yards. And then you take that hot steam and high pressure, and you take it through a steam turbine, you drop it down temperature, pressure, and all of a sudden you're back on the goal line, and you say, my gosh, I'm a water molecule here. If you have me go over that goal line, I will do a 1,700 to 1 collapse of volume by going over that goal line, and therefore my turbine would actually go backwards. Yes, sir.
But I guess what I don't understand is you don't talk about thermodynamic efficiency at all. So from the previous picture that you had, the efficiency of the cycle that you're showing is around 60%, actually 59%.
Right.
You can do a combined cycle plant that's just as efficient.
Yes,
You can get back over 60%.
absolutely.
So why is this appropriate?
Because we capture carbon dioxide and they don't.
I don't see you capturing it because you can see it flowing out.
We capture the carbon dioxide. You can't help but capture it, but you can actually.
Go to your diagrams flowing out of the system.
But where does it flow? It flows. That's the question. Next question is where does it flow? And there's more that flows out of this. Just to be clear, because CO2, this much CO2 flows out of here. That much oxygen, that much argon, that much nitrogen flow out of the air separation unit. What do we do with CO2? You sort of anticipated the next section. CO2 at volume and at low cost has several uses. The problem is it has never been captured at sufficient cost except for the CO2 that's currently being used for enhanced oil recovery. But if you can capture it in sufficient volume at sufficient cost, there are all sorts of things that you can use it for. It's like everything else out there. It's a matter of cost benefit. Direct use, it can be used as a working fluid or as a solvent. It can be used for the alum cycle as net power. It can be used for enhanced oil recovery. We'll touch that later. Beverages, cleaning. It could actually be sequestered, be put right back into the ground, and stored. That's right. You would have to pay for CO2. Although with this particular technology, our marginal cost of CO2 is 0. We're the only technology that's ever come along that says we can give you CO2 for free. We've never been that place. Right now, the cost of CO2. Sorry? Or you have to pay to capture it. For instance, if you were those two power plants that you talk about, the CO2 costs, if you were to amortize the right part of that cost of those add-on equipments and the efficiency hit, you roughly need $60 a ton for that CO2. Now, conversion, we can take it into ordinary chemistry, we can use it for photochemistry, biochemistry, we can use it for all sorts of other things, cement, concrete, a lot of these other uses. The CO2 market is immense at the right price. So we see, Lancetech using CO2 for all of this. We've got Solidia, which is a BP, BASF, Oil and Gas Climate Initiative investment. We've got people.
This is the thing I'm struggling with. Just imagine there's a demand curve for how much people use it. The first unit of CO2, people use it. I get to my Diet Coke. Okay, we'll go right back to here. If we wanted to measure the number of net power 300 megawatt power plants that the world could use against different metrics, the first being the number of power plants that you could use in a region according to the IEA, on the basis of their projected power demand. All of this is some price that people are paying for CO2.
Well,
So I think that seems like that's the key thing.
but let me just Power demand at 2040. If we're just going off of power demand at 2040, you can build that many, the left-hand column, number of plants for net power. If you're going off the EOR demand, there's demand for more than all the power plants that the IEA projects. There's more demand for CO2 for EOR than there exists demand for power plants. So the demand exceeds the amount of the demand for CO2. Then for enhanced coal bed methane recovery, it gets even bigger. And this is not including the demand for all these others. But at the price, at the cost of, for instance, if we have CO2 to sell at $10 a ton, that's economic for everything. That would justify building all of those plants. The other way to look at it is this slide that I was going to hit. 1.1 trillion tons of CO2 could be sequestered in the world through enhanced oil recovery.
But that doesn't actually get rid of the problem, because you're actually producing fossil fuels that will be used to be burned.
But the ratio is 2 to 1. The ratio is 2 to 1. The problem that a lot of people have is when you're doing thermodynamics, one of the problems that people have is, especially students, is that they draw the system boundary at the wrong place. And if you draw the system boundary here around both the transportation system and the power producing system, you will see that the current state for power plants, we're throwing for every ton of CO2 that we throw into the atmosphere, we could instead use that for 1.5 barrels of oil, in which case that throws back into 0.08 for refining, 0.40 for the transportation fuels, 0.14 in power plants. And we would have 1.62 tons of CO2 emitted. If you couple the two systems together, you end up dropping your CO2 emission by coupling the systems together, drawing the system boundary around the two, you cut it dramatically. The reason is 2 CO2 molecules, 2 carbon molecules stay in the ground for every carbon molecule you remove. Now, intrinsically, why would that happen? Well, because what's in the ground happens to be long-chain hydrocarbons, and what you can put into the ground are very compressible gases. So it's a 2 to 1 ratio. These are perfect. Now we go back, and this sort of says what EOR is. EOR backfills oil with CO2 molecules, and it does it on a 2 to 1 basis. Let's look at concrete. There are 2 billion tons of concrete produced, used in the world every year. 100 million tons of concrete used in the US. Using the technology that Solidia and other similar companies are working on, they can fix 30% by weight of that volume of concrete with CO2. In fact, they can double fix it if you use CO2 at high pressure and high energy levels, and you produce, instead of carbonates, you actually put bicarbonates in these aggregates. So the use of CO2, this is where people need to focus. And this is why I sort of said that at the very beginning, teeing this up. CO2 is not a bad thing. It's just in the wrong place, and we don't know how to use it. Why? Because we never had it economically available to use and to sequester or to incorporate in products.
Can I ask a question about that? So, when I see the profiles of net power, I mean, a lot of the profiles we talked about the bottom line economics of the whole system. How central is being able to sell the CO2 for EOR? It seems like EOR is pretty important for your overall value proposition. How important is being able to sell the CO2 for EOR versus, yeah, so we'll start with that. How important is that to your overall business model?
It's a piece of it. It's a piece of it. However, the work that we're doing on CO2 conversion in chemical reactions, we're doing a huge amount of. In fact, there's a global X Prize on CO2 use that's underway right now. And so a lot of people who are working on this X Prize are working on this very topic. Our goal is to make this CO2 either sequestrable in the ground. We can definitely make it sequestrable if 45Q came along, which is a tax incentive. That would be easy. In fact, it's almost too easy. We could definitely make it just purely sequestrable and not usable for EOR, but just dump it in the ground. That would provide the right economics. You can put it into concrete. I love the concrete thing because what the concrete thing does is this. We have not had a major revolution in building products for a long, long time. One of the problems with concrete cement is it needs to cure. Concrete needs a lot of water for it to cure. If you go out and build a bridge or do some highway infrastructure project, it will take 3 weeks for that to cure. Yet, using these processes, CO2 will cure instantly, such that you could actually extrude a CO2 I-beam, a concrete I-beam. You could actually 3D print a house. Additive manufacturing, CO2 can open up additive manufacturing processes and in ways that we haven't ever dreamt of. But
This is what I'm still struggling with. How much you guys would you pay to be cost competitive with a natural gas process?
how much do we?
Need to be paid per ton of CO2.
Zero.
And what am I missing?
Zero. Look back to these. Look back to this. Normally, we're 60% efficient. A 60% power plant takes $34 million worth of natural gas at these prices. We can talk about the prices. To produce $88 million with electricity. This is, what, $2.85 gas, and this is 4-cent electricity. That's a 60% power plant. In addition, because the whole net power process is an air separation unit and a CO2 capturing, we have these off gases that we're also capturing. If you add up those off gases up there, the nitrogen, we're pricing it at 8 a ton there. The CO2 we're pricing conservatively at 15 a ton. The argon's at 300 a ton. Argon actually in bottles, you probably are going to, in a welding shop, you'll pay closer to several thousand a ton. But these are wholesale at the spigot type prices. So as you'll see, there's $71 million a year worth of non-power coming off of this plant for every $88 million that come off in electricity. Yes.
So you have to have some outlet for the CO2, right? So you have to basically get out and put this stuff and use it. That's going to be the cost.
Yes, we have to deliver it to people who want to buy it or want to use it, or at the very worst, if nobody wants to buy it, if all we want to sequester it, we use those other income streams to fund just pure sequestration down into the ground. But because we believe that these gases all have economic uses and economic demand.
So before you can commission a plant, and every one of these plants, before you can commission it, has to have.
It doesn't have to have these offtakes. These offtakes, I mean, early on, the offtakes will be important. But we have a line of sight where, by roughly looking at things called learning curves, where this thing will be 100% economic, selling only the electricity and throwing the rest of the stuff away. The operating cost is less than a traditional plant. We don't have a steam cycle. We don't have all the problems of a steam cycle. We have the capital cost after 30 or so plants converges on existing capital costs of existing power plants for combined cycle, natural gas combined cycle. We've got a version 2.0 of it that will cut the capital cost by about 3/8 beyond that.
You're saying, and I'm sorry, I'm using this little bit, we sign zero to all the off gases. They just mean they have to clear whatever they want. You can sell it to the grid.
We could sell it to the grid. I wouldn't say plant numbers 1 through 29, but plants number 30, we're there. I mean, even if you look, for instance, at what they say with Petronova, they say if we have to build version number 2 of Petronova, we'll save 20% on version 2. I mean, those are typical learning curves that you are over-engineering or you're buying the first unit, not 10 units together. And so in learning curves, so as we calculate the learning curves, we converge on a regular power plant. Now, with policy, we converge immediately. Oh, if someone said that there was going to be a carbon tax, like in Europe or the UK, in the UK where there definitely is a carbon tax, and furthermore, they actually have they're constrained by what they can do. Coal plants are being shut down. Their natural gas are all imported LNG, so LNG prices are a lot higher than 285. The UK, we converge pretty fast. In other parts of the world, in the Middle East, we converge really fast. And by the way, for sequestration, we'll put this slide in here. You can sequester in the United States alone 2.6 trillion metric tons. The green areas and the blue areas are where you just simply sequester it. That's saline and sedimentary. The orange and yellow areas are coal beds where you can actually do enhanced coal bed methane recovery. You can inject the CO2 and into coal beds, and the methane will come out instead of mining coal. And the red areas are where enhanced oil recovery can happen. First commercial plant, we're commissioning our demonstration plant down in Houston, Texas right now. Commissioning is not like a regular plant commissioning. Regular plant commissioning takes a few months. Our plant takes even longer because we're commissioning a bunch of test things and combinations that haven't been operated together in this particular fashion, but they've all been operated before. Our timeline is, while this plant will be up and running, the demonstration plant will be up and running this year. Our full-scale plant will be up and running in the first quarter of 2021. That would be a 300 megawatt plant. The markets that we can address, but it's a confluence of the markets of industrial gases, power generation, and oil. Large amount of markets there. We've been through this slide before. The DOE specifically named the alum cycle in one of its recent FOAs, where they're wanting to get more people designing turbines for the alum cycle. So that's specifically been named. U.S. and Saudi just signed an MOU for working together, and if you look at it, the MOU covers supercritical carbon dioxide power cycles, that's us. Carbon capture, utilization, storage, that's us. Chemical looping, not us. Oxycombustion, us. Energy water nexus, we don't need water, we actually produce it. UK has highlighted net power in their 2017 clean growth strategy document. We'll change the oil stack and the cost of delivering oil because we'll loosen up more oil that can be, will extend the use of existing oil fields rather than having to go out and drill in places that we haven't drilled before. So we'll, and there's that. We also integrate with other things. We integrate with the LNG, liquefied natural gas regasification for, we can integrate directly with an EOR field, and by integrating with an EOR field, we become even more efficient because you don't have to spend all that energy separating separating the CO2 away from the gases. We can burn the gases with impure streams. We can do solar hybrid, where instead of burning gas, because we're pushing heat around that state of Tennessee looking thing, we can take concentrated solar power at the top of that cycle and reduce the amount of gas that we need. Yes? You know, this is the problem. This is the problem with us. I mean, we were this too good to be true technology. In fact, people wouldn't return phone calls, and they would, at the very early stages, they would just say, "Oh, you can't do this." And then when people actually model it, at this point, I'm sure that PhD students, hundreds of PhD students have modeled this. Energy companies have modeled this. They've done what are called heat mass balance models. We've got, so yes, I agree with you. Too good to be true. Sometimes, that's what every breakthrough ends up starting as. They're all waiting for this. I mean, they're all sitting around waiting for us to show, to prove out, to show that we can do all this stuff. Because why would they want to invest in an experiment that someone else is paying for right now? So this is unfolding. Yes, sir.
So, as you mentioned, the process produces moist CO2.
Yes.
So, what are the issues in piping that around? Is that going to be a barrier for you?
We have to separate it out. You're absolutely right. If you have CO2 needs to, when it goes into a pipeline, it needs to be dry, because otherwise it turns into carbonic acid, which is very corrosive. So you need to get rid of the moisture content of the CO2 before you put it in the pipeline, although you don't need to be so worrisome about moisture reduction if you re-inject that CO2 back down in an enhanced oil recovery field. Because those fields are already wet, they typically use what's called a WAG process, where they're alternating water and gas, alternating. So there's already, this is another place where by not having to dry out the CO2, we actually get more efficient, get efficiency gains by not having to dry it out. Yes?
You described how the turbines would use CO2 as part of the working fluid by recycling it through. Does that mean that you have to use less natural gas than traditional natural gas turbines, or not?
We're using the same amount of natural gas. If we're just think of it this way: if we're 60% efficient, and a normal natural gas turbine is 60% efficient, it ends up taking 100 units of fuel, putting out 60 units of electricity, which brings us back to the why did I say earlier that just a normal natural gas plant produced 40% in that first diagram. And the reason I said that is normally what happens in a normal power plant, is this. This comes out, as I say here, this is what's called a simple cycle gas turbine. It's only a gas turbine. But a bunch of heat is, and think of that as like a jet engine hanging on the side of a wing of an airplane. That's all it is. And if you went behind that jet engine and put a little boiler there with some water in it, and you heated up that boiler using the exhaust heat and used steam and created this inefficient steam cycle, that's what a combined cycle is. And by the time you slap those two together, you got 40% efficiency coming out of your gas part of your turbine, and the other 20% of your efficiency coming out of the steam part of your turbine. That's why it's called a combined cycle. I combine a gas cycle and a steam cycle together. But totally they're 60% efficient. But if it is 60% efficient, I am taking in 100 units of methane, producing 60 units of power, and for 100 units of methane, I'm producing, I can't help it, chemistry is chemistry. I have to produce a stoichiometric amount of carbon dioxide that relates to that 100 units of methane from combusting it. Yes, sir?
Where in the system do you reject the heat?
We reject it 2 places. If you think about it, we are one place is we're taking the heat in through here, this heat, and we're pushing it up. And we're using it to reheat the recycled gas flow. So 20% of that is,
Well, you have to work, you have to get that out at the end, anyway. I mean, you're 60% efficient, so 40% is going somewhere.
that's right. So the other rejected heat is coming out of here, this dome here.
I mean, you have cooling towers,
Well, it's coming out.
water, you're not rejecting it through the river.
Let's suppose that, just put this model in your head. Let's suppose that we have a system losses of 10% and 90% of it's generally used for something, or it's rejected through cooling towers. So in our case, 10% of it, 10% of it's rejected in cooling, a little over 10% is rejected in cooling towers. Another 10% is used to produce electricity that will fund my air separation unit. And another 10% is used to produce electricity that will fund the recompression. So our total efficiency for the entire process on an electrical basis happens to be 83% efficient, which means that 10% of the stuff is sort of going into cooling towers, going up into the air, or 17% is going into cooling towers into the air system losses. But the rest of it is sort of staying in the system.
It's to the air.
That's right, to the air or friction losses or things, yes.
So, see the Tennessee graph and take the model 500 PhDs above that. When was this invented, and is there any demonstration in a lab or?
First of all, CO2 going round and round, but there's 5,400 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines in this country. And which means that we know what compression of CO2 looks like. And so we know this left-hand part of this stuff very well. We know what compression of CO2 looks like and pumping of CO2 looks like. It's well known. So the left-hand part of that's known. As far as heat exchangers, it's an advanced heat exchanger. And as far as the turbine, we're just moving different working fluid. Now, why hadn't this been thought of before? Is another question I get. It's this. We did three things that other people didn't do. People always knew CO2 had special properties. They tried to, people tried making argon turbines. They tried to make turbines out of all sorts of. You make the back of your refrigerator. You've got something that used to have Freon in it, now has other stuff in it, but it's a matter of taking heat, compressing it, and moving temperature around. Compression, expansion, compression, expansion. So we know about compression, expansion of working fluids. But somebody, it was Mitsui Babcock in '05, did a version of this cycle down here. And they stopped. And they just stayed in the lower half. And as this brings up something I like to say is that people generally think of when you do a thermal cycle, there are three rules. First rule, one part of the cycle has to be at atmospheric pressure. Second rule, one part of the cycle has to be at ambient temperature. And third rule, if you got some heat, you don't know what to do with it, boil some water. And that's sort of what they've done. We violate two of those rules. We don't boil water because we're using something totally different. Water, for all those reasons of the football field, is a very inefficient working fluid. And also, we start at 30 bar, not atmospheric pressure. And so by starting here, something interesting happened. The recompression piece, we knew that we could recompress all the way up to the top. But people thought, well, why should we cool and then pump the rest of the way? And then they thought, well, if we cool, where do we get the energy back? Well, look at what's happening up here at the top of those blue lines up here at the top where I say number 6, additional heat. That's going from roughly a little over 50 degrees centigrade up to a little under 160 degrees centigrade. That's what generally is called waste heat. People don't think that heat is worth anything. They always assume that we can never use something that's below boiling point and it's a little bit above boiling point, you can never use it. And so normally that heat is the heat that's coming off of compressors, pumps, it's the heat that's coming off of your air separation unit. They normally never thought that you should ever scavenge that heat because it's too low. And yet, at 300 bar, with carbon dioxide, that heat is worth a boatload. And I think that is the most magic part of what we saw that no one else saw.
First of all, I love the Tennessee graph. Don't understand it, but I love it. Quick question, the number 3 and 7 heat exchangers just going out, are they physically connected or are they connected?
Yeah, they're physically connected. So it's like your car radiator. You know, your car radiator, you know, when you turn on your car in the wintertime or most of the time in Chicago, when you turn on your car, cold air blows out. What has to happen is your engine has to get hot enough so that the water that's circulating through the radiator is hot, so that when the air sucks in across that hot radiator, it blows warm air against your feet. And that's a heat exchanger. Now, normally, that hot air is going outside your car and into the atmosphere, but it's going on your feet when the heater's on. And so that's what a heat exchanger. A heat exchanger is exchanging heat between a hot side and the cool side. And so, I have to admit, a heat exchanger is one of the hardest concepts to wrap your head around. You know, you can understand why two things will stabilize at the same heat. You know, if I open up my window, the inside of my house will be the same as the outside of my house. I get that. But I also, if you were on the outside of your house and you touched your window would feel warm. And if you're on the inside of your house and you touch the window, it feels cold. And that window is a heat exchanger. And it's making the cold warmer or the warm colder. And that's what's happening here.
That was just my lead up.
I think we have time for one question.
Okay.
You said the new part is the CO2 turbine, using CO2 is working. Does that exist?
Yes, Sandia Labs has made CO2 turbines. Other people have made CO2 turbines. So I'll come back to that. But you said one more question. One more question. Yes.
So I wanted to follow up on that, because I remember seeing a talk by some of the safety guys maybe 5 years ago. So maybe they've addressed a lot of this. But I remember they were running into quite a few challenges with CO2 turbines. They're great. They're smaller. They're high power density, all this sort of thing. I think what they cared about more was power density. But I remember they were having trouble. I don't remember what the trouble was.
They had several. The biggest trouble that Sandia had is Sandia was purely running a closed loop, like your refrigerator, okay? Because they were running a closed loop, and because CO2 is such a great solvent, okay? It's really a good solvent. You might have, at some point, about 15, 20 years ago, people were opening up CO2 dry cleaning stores, dry cleaning shops. It's a great solvent for organic compounds. It's such a good solvent that it helps you remove caffeine from coffee. It's a great solvent. Well, guess what? It's a great solvent, and therefore all the oil around all the bearings got out into the working fluid. And so that whole Sandia turbine was just an oil vapor machine. And they just didn't, and so they had a problem with their bearings, and they had an unusual concentration of oil. They had other things. There were a lot of things that they learned. The other problem that they had was this, and I'll end it here. When people design systems, they tend to stand on a foundation that's pre-existing. They made the control of their turbine, the control system of their turbine, created feedback loops. And think of it as if you turn off your sink in a house, really quickly, sometimes you'll hear in some old houses, boom, 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 boom. That shock going through the pipes. Yet, if you, instead of turning off the water at the spigot of your sink, you could magically turn it on and off outside the house, you wouldn't hear that resonating through the house. So they were turning on and off their turbine at the wrong place. And they created a lot of resonances in their turbine. Why? Well, this is the reason you always did gas turbines. Of course you can do gas turbines that way. You've got an infinite source of air and an infinite sink of air, sucking all this air in, blowing it all out. When you close a loop, you create resonances that you never, ever expected. So anyway, thank you very much. If you have questions, I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards.